It's good to be back. This is my first week back after a 2 week vacation. And while I was on vacation, we had a family camping weekend at my parents' house. It's something that we do every year. We've done it for a long time. My dad's whole side of the family gets together. So he's one of six siblings, and then there's cousins that come. And we were outside and had a good time together for camping. But that side of the family likes to tell jokes. And there's one thing from that's been consistent from my childhood all the way up is that at some point throughout a weekend like that, or if we used to always get together for Easter or things like that, there will be jokes that are told, and oftentimes there's some of these same jokes that get recycled every year. You can kind of depend on these jokes being told, and one that floated around when I was younger that actually ties in with the sermon this morning, so there is something that we're going here. But it was maybe one of the most horrendous dad jokes that there is. And I'm going to spare you and not actually tell the joke. I'm going to explain it, and then you'll see where we're going with this. But, and actually, it would be hard to even tell the joke in the format of a sermon. But you start out, and typically this joke is told to younger teens. By the time we were older, we started to figure out we would just not even stay to listen. But it starts out with this story of this man who's going to build a shed, and so he measures it, he's really careful, and of course the person telling the joke would elaborate on and on about how this man goes about building his shed. He's a perfectionist. He orders just the right number of bricks, and after this long 5-minute story, at the end of the story, he gets done with the shed, and there's one brick left. He miscalculated by one brick, and he's so angry that he takes the brick and he just throws it up into the air. And the story's done. The joke is done. That's it. And of course, as young kids, you know it's supposed to be a joke, and you think it's supposed to be funny, and sometimes at that point you don't even know it's funny or not, and so you kind of laugh at it, and you walk away wondering, what did I miss? What's going on here? And then at some point later in the day, the same joke teller will tell another joke. And this joke is on an airplane. There's a woman with a poodle and a man who's smoking a cigar. And of course, probably it would be explained that there was a point in time when you could have smoked on planes. And again, you elaborate. It's this long story about this man with a cigar, this woman with a poodle. They get in such an argument on the plane because they're sitting next to each other, and the man doesn't like the poodle, and the woman doesn't like the cigar. And the stewardesses don't take care of the situation. And so finally, after this long story, the man grabs the poodle and he throws it out the window of the plane, which of course can't happen, but it's a joke. And the woman takes the man's cigar and throws that out the window of the plane, and they ride the rest of their flight. And when they're landing on the tarmac, they're getting out of the plane, and they look out, and on the wing of the plane, there they see the dog. And at this point, the joke teller will say, "And what do you think the dog had in its mouth?" And of course, you've long forgotten the first story. You're in this story because it's multiple hours later, and you say, "The cigar." Everybody who's listening thinks this dog has the cigar in its mouth. And the punchline of the joke is, the dog has the brick from the story from long before. So anyways, that probably took too long to tell, even as it was. But it was a joke that was told at least once a year. It is funnier for the joke teller than it is for the people listening. But our Matthew series feels a little bit to me like that joke. If you weren't aware, if you're newer in joining our congregation or listening to these sermons, you maybe aren't aware that we have been in the book of Matthew for 4 years, almost 4 years, 3.5. That I've been teaching and preaching through the book of Matthew. And I intentionally, when I structured the series, realized that it's a longer book. It was going to take a long time to get through. And so I spaced it out, and we would do 6 to 8 weeks in Matthew, and then we'd do a series 6 to 8 weeks in something else. And if we had just done Matthew, we would have gotten through it a lot faster. But it was intentional in trying to break it up a little bit. And I actually have a planning document on my computer that's saved, that is planning document for the end of Matthew. And I intentionally spaced the end of the book of Matthew out, that we would land on Matthew 28, which is the final chapter of the book, on Easter Sunday of 2020. But what was not included in that planning document was COVID. And so with some of the changes and adjustments, we decided to take a break from the book of Matthew. We didn't get to finish. And in a lot of ways, when I went back, our new plan is actually to end with a kind of our Easter Sunday service on September 13th, which is going to be our Covenant Sunday when we renew our covenants, and we're doing a bunch of stuff with that Sunday. But looking back, it feels like we actually ended with a false punchline in the book of Matthew. This whole story of Jesus was building, it was growing, it was headed somewhere, and the final sentence that we read from Matthew back all the way in February of this year, 6 months ago, the final sentence that we read in Matthew before we took this break was that Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. And in many ways, with the story of Jesus in general, but especially the story of Jesus as Matthew presents it, that is meant to be almost this false punchline. Jesus has been predicting his death. There's been this conflict growing, and we get to this point that Jesus is handed over to be crucified, and it feels like the end of the story, and for us, it was for 6 months. But now we finally are coming back to Matthew to jump back into this story and say, what does Matthew say is actually the real punchline to this story? What is it that the story of Jesus is actually focused on, and how does that impact how we live our lives and what it means to follow Jesus faithfully in our lives today? And I'm going to give you a hint that for Matthew, the punchline of the story of Jesus is not the cross. The cross is extremely important, but the punchline of the story for Matthew is not the cross. And so thinking about jumping back into Matthew at this point of the story that we're probably most familiar with, which is the crucifixion and the resurrection. It's the part of the story we most often look at and read. And so jumping into the story at that point, after we've already passed the false punchline, felt like it might be a little bit like telling the story of the woman and the man on the plane. And then when they land and the brick is in the dog's mouth, we're all left scratching our heads wondering, wait, where did that brick come from again? I remember something about it, but I don't remember all the details. So before we jump back into the crucifixion of Jesus, this morning we're going to take time to look back and review the whole book of Matthew, to remember the story that has brought us up to this point. So strap in. It might take a couple years. Just kidding. Hopefully we can go through this pretty quickly. First, the first thing that we see in Matthew that actually starts in the very first chapter is that Matthew, while people in the story are confused about who Jesus is and there's questions about his identity, Matthew, for us as the readers, he's totally upfront. And so the first sentence of the first book, or the first chapter of Matthew is, "This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Matthew goes to great lengths to present Jesus as fulfilling all of the Old Testament scriptures, as standing in the line of David, in the line of Abraham. Matthew structures the book around these 5 sermons. Hopefully, if you've been around for the last number of years, this is somewhat familiar for you. But there's 5 sermons in Matthew, with then Jesus' actions surrounding those sermons. And Matthew is presenting Jesus as the new Moses. Moses presented the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, which is the foundation of the Jewish belief, Jewish faith. And Jesus is presented as going onto mountains and sitting down and teaching the people like Moses. And so we see Jesus presented as the new Moses, as the new Israel. He flees to Egypt. He comes back, is baptized through the Jordan River, just as the Israelites were. He's presented as the son of David, as the true king of the Jews, who's coming to bring God's kingdom of heaven. And Matthew, more than any of the other gospel writers, is just constantly referring back to Old Testament prophecies to show how Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies. And so we see all of that is how Jesus is presented, but even more than that, Matthew goes one step beyond that. Not only is Jesus fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies, but there's something surprising. Jesus is presented as the Son of God, as God himself in a human body come to save his people from their sins. And so again, in the first chapter, we see that Mary's told that she's supposed to give him the name Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. And just 2 verses later it says, "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. And there might be questions early on in the book about what exactly does that mean, but those questions are very quickly blown away for us as the reader. Not necessarily for the people in the story, but for us as the reader, because at Jesus' baptism, we are allowed to hear that a voice was spoken, that God himself spoke in the baptism of Jesus and said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." And immediately a conflict erupts because Jesus goes from his baptism into the wilderness where he is tempted by Satan. And the main temptation from Satan is, if you are the Son of God, then do these things to prove it. If you really are the Son of God. And this is the question of the whole book of Matthew, is this question of, is Jesus who he claims to be? Is Jesus the Son of God? Not just is Jesus the Messiah, because the Jewish people had a category for that. They understood the concept of Messiah, but Jesus claimed to be more. He claimed to be the Son of God. And so then in chapter 14, verse 33, we see Jesus in a boat with his disciples. It's in a section where Matthew is very intentional about organizing these stories of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus in a way to make a point. He's not as interested in the chronological history of Jesus' life as he is in creating meaning, in the meaning behind Jesus' life. And so in Matthew 14, there's these stories that build, showing Jesus' authority, his power over disease, over sickness, over demons, and then even over the created realm. When Jesus is in a boat, a big storm comes up, and Jesus simply speaks, "Peace, be still." And the wind and the waves obey him. And we're told that everyone in the boat, now we're led to believe it's probably all his disciples, but maybe even others, everyone in the boat worshipped him and said, "Truly you are the Son of God." Imagine this. Think about this. These Jewish men and potentially women in the boat worshiping a human being, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." And then just 2 chapters later in chapter 16, Jesus is asking his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter again says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then we come just 1 chapter later in the Transfiguration, chapter 17, when Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up onto a mountain. He's transfigured into all his glory in front of them. And once again, there's a voice that booms from heaven saying, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Almost the same words as what came at Jesus' baptism. And then all the way at the end of the story, and well, not quite the end, but the end of the story as far as we got, in chapter 26, verse 63, this is the charge against Jesus by the high priest at Jesus' trial. He says, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And so Matthew presents Jesus as the Son of God. Consistent. This is a theme from the beginning of the book all the way to the end of the book. And we're going to see, actually, it's picked up even further as we go at the crucifixion site. This question of, is Jesus the Son of God? Is he who he claims to be? And what does it mean if he is? Another theme through the entire book is this idea that faith in Jesus, believing in this claim of Jesus that he is the Son of God, goes hand in hand with faithfulness to Jesus' teachings. You cannot believe that Jesus is who he says he is unless you are willing to follow and obey the things that he says about how we are to live. Faith and faithfulness go hand in hand. And this is highlighted through the stories as well, but especially through the sermons of Jesus. And so in chapters 5 through 7, we find the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus, the Son of God, gives a prayer in the middle, saying, "This is how you ought to pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." We're familiar with the Lord's Prayer. But then all of the Sermon on the Mount around that is structured around showing us, if this is how we pray, then this is how we ought to live. If we truly believe that God is our Father in heaven, then this is how we live on earth. If we truly desire our daily bread, then this is how we treat our possessions. If we truly want to be forgiven, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, or forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us, then this is how we ought to treat those who sin against us. And so this whole Sermon on the Mount is structured around this idea of, if we have faith in God, if we pray, then we will live faithfully according to the pattern of what Jesus teaches us. And then in chapter 10, the next sermon that we find is Jesus preparing his disciples and sending them out on mission. He says, I didn't just come to do all the work of the kingdom myself. I came to prepare you, and I send you. And he sends them out 2 by 2. And again, we see here this pairing of trust. They are to trust God for their strength. They're not supposed to take anything on the journey with them. He says, you're going to face challenges, but even if you're brought before kings and judges, don't worry, because I will give you the words to speak. The Spirit will speak through you. And so again, their faith is paired with their faithfulness. Then we come to chapter 13, the next set. This is the third sermon in Matthew. And again, remember that these parallel the 5 books of the Old Testament, the 5 books of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, that Moses gave. In chapter 13, the conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders is heating up. It's getting tense. And so Jesus tells these parables. It's a sermon of parables. Once again showing that faith in God is shown and displayed through faithfulness to his teachings. That faith in Jesus means living out the principles of the kingdom of heaven here and now, and that those who refuse to follow and obey Jesus' teachings are refusing to follow God and have no place in God's kingdom. Then we move forward, and the other thing in the parables in that third sermon in Matthew 13 is that there's a choice. There's only 2 options. Either you follow Jesus or you don't. Either you have faith in Jesus and you faithfully obey, or you don't. And then we move on to Matthew 18 through 20. This is the 4th sermon in the book of Matthew. It's a sermon on the teachings on the church. What does it mean to be the church? And the emphasis, especially Matthew 18, is looking at, so how do we, if we have faith in Jesus and we are living faithfully, how do we relate to those who aren't? How do we relate to those who fall away, or who wrong us, or who sin? And the message of this teaching on the church is that part of living faithfully, part of having faith in Jesus, is forgiving our enemies, forgiving those who wrong us, is having patience and compassion, and living in kindness, even with others within the church who end up making wrong decisions or poor decisions. And it talks about, there's the parable of the 99 and leaving the 99 to find the one sheep who has wandered off, or the parable of the man who owes a great debt and it's forgiven him by the king, and then he goes out and chokes his friend who owes him a very small amount. And this idea that we are to forgive just as God has forgiven us. Our faith in God goes hand in hand with our faithfulness in how we treat our neighbor. Our love for God goes hand in hand with how we love and interact with our neighbor. And then the 5th and final sermon in the book of Matthew is chapters 23 through 25, which is Jesus teaching on Israel. Jesus, it's kind of the final point of this conflict that's been brewing between Jesus and the religious leaders. And we find in chapter 23, Jesus challenging head on the woes against the Pharisees, calling out their hypocrisy and the fact that their faith and their faithfulness are not in line, that what they say and how they act, how they live, don't line up. And then in chapter 24, Jesus talks about the consequences, about the judgment that is coming on Israel because of their lack of faithfulness. And then in Matthew 25, once again, we find parables that talk about, because of a lack of faithfulness, that God is going to use another avenue. God is finding another way to bring his kingdom into the world rather than through Israel. And so once again, all 5 of these sermons are centered around this idea of faith and faithfulness. Who will be faithful to the kingdom of heaven? Who will be faithful to God's principles and the way that God teaches us to live? Who will be faithful not just in the big things, in the things that seem to matter, but in the small things, in the small actions? Realizing it's not just about the outward expression of how we live, but it's about our inward expression of how we think about others, how we treat others in our hearts and in our minds and in our words. And so our faith in Jesus must be paired with faithfulness to his teaching. If we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, as Jesus claims and as Matthew claims, then we must obey him if we want to be part of this kingdom of heaven that he is bringing. So those are the first two things that we see in Matthew, that Jesus is the Son of God, that faith and faithfulness go hand in hand. And the third thing that we see is that faith comes in the most surprising places, while the religious and political leaders reject Jesus. I already talked a little bit about the conflict that we find brewing throughout the book, and some of the conflict is that Jesus is challenging the religious leaders' understanding of how they ought to follow God. And he's not only challenging that, but he's challenging their power and authority, because he says that faith and right living is bubbling up out of the most surprising places. And so we find this already happening before Jesus has even said a word. At the very beginning in the birth story of Jesus, those who come in the book of Matthew to visit Jesus, we don't find shepherds, we don't find some of these things we find in some of the other gospels. It's magi from the east. It's foreign pagan astrologers who recognize from the stars that Jesus is the King of the world and come to worship him. And they end up coming to the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, who then search their scriptures and say, well, the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem. So they have an opportunity to come and worship the Messiah as well, but they don't. It's the faith of the outsider, the faith of the Magi, and it's actually the Jewish people who rally around Herod to try to kill the Messiah. And that's kind of a spoiler alert right at the beginning of the book, Matthew chapter 2. Then we move on. Jesus' first miracles in Matthew chapter 8, that he heals a leper, a centurion, and a woman who would have all been despised by Jewish men who would have seen them in some way unclean. A Roman centurion, a leper, and a woman. And when the Roman centurion comes and speaks with Jesus, we find these words of Jesus: I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then we fast forward to Matthew chapter 15, where Jesus takes a rare venture outside of Judea and Galilee in the book of Matthew. And he goes to this place where he runs into a Canaanite woman. And the woman is asking for healing for her daughter, and there's this odd exchange that goes on. Jesus says, should I throw the bread from the table? And she says, but even the dogs lick up the crumbs. And what we find at the end of that is Jesus says, woman, you have great faith. After Jesus says, I've come to the lost sheep of Israel, I haven't come to the Gentiles, he still sees the faith of this woman and rewards her faith. And the following story right after that is Jesus duplicates the feeding of the 5,000. Now in Gentile territory, he gathers 4,000 people and he feeds them miraculously, just as he fed the 5,000 earlier in Matthew. Now he feeds 4,000 Gentiles. Faith is found in the most surprising places. We see this again in chapter 20 when we see these stories right after each other of a rich young ruler coming to Jesus and not having faith, of the Pharisees coming and challenging Jesus rather than having faith, of the disciples arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus essentially says, you guys still don't get it. And then we see two blind men as Jesus is approaching Jerusalem, who cry out in faith and are shown as examples of faith, when all these others, the rich, the powerful, even the disciples, miss it and don't understand. Faith comes in the most surprising places. And this is captured most fully near again the end of the story, Matthew 26. A lot of these themes that Matthew builds through the book kind of culminate here in the last few chapters, where we see all of Jesus' disciples even turning against him. Jesus has told them through the whole story that he's going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to die, and he's even told them he's going to rise again. But coming to the end, he says, you are all going to desert me, and two of you, Judas is going to betray me, and Peter is going to deny me. And I don't know if you remember or not, but we saw how through chapter 25 and 26, it follows these stories of Peter, and then Judas, and then Peter, and then Judas, and Peter, and Judas, with this question of, and Jesus mixed in there, of who will be faithful? And Jesus is shown as the only faithful one, while Peter will deny, Judas will betray, all the disciples will desert Jesus, and then we run into this story of Jesus in Bethany, in the middle of all of this. And a woman comes and anoints Jesus' feet with oil. And what Jesus says is that she is preparing him for his burial. And so here in the end of the story, there is a faithful one. There's somebody who's heard and has understood and has faith in the words of Jesus, understanding that he will die. And it's an unnamed woman who is shamed by everyone else present at the meal, as she comes and anoints Jesus' feet with oil. And Jesus says, truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. And so what we've seen so far is that Jesus is shown to be the Son of God. That's the central claim of the book of Matthew. And believing that, having faith in Jesus as the Son of God, means living faithfully, actually following and obeying the things that Jesus teaches us to do. But that this faith, this faithfulness comes in the most surprising places, from the most surprising people. It doesn't look like following the Sabbath laws like the Pharisees thought that it should look like. It doesn't look like following all of even the ritual purity that went along with first century Judaism, as the Pharisees thought that it should. It doesn't look even like the religious devotion of praying publicly and attending all the worship services as the first century Jews thought that it should. Instead, faith and faithfulness comes in the most surprising places from the most surprising people who we even, 2,000 years later, claiming to be followers of Jesus, sometimes are still caught off guard by as we read through the book of Matthew and say, wait, but them? They're the one with faith, not Peter, not James, not John. Jesus is presented as the Son of God. Faith and faithfulness go in hand. Faith comes in the most surprising places. And then the last thing that we see is that Jesus is portrayed as the only truly faithful one, who would rather die than resort to evil in the form of violence. And so Jesus ends up standing in the place of Israel. All of the prophecies, all the promises towards Israel are fulfilled in Jesus as he takes away the sins of the world. And so Jesus' faith is displayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he promises faithfulness to the will of God, even if it requires his death. And in the Last Supper, where Jesus says, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. We see that Jesus here at the end of the story actually lives out his faith in God. As God, but also as fully human, Jesus lives out the things he's been teaching. Jesus himself is the only one who is faithful, going all the way to the cross, being willing to die rather than to go against the things that he has taught about loving enemies and about forgiveness and all the other things that he's taught throughout this gospel. And not only that, Jesus lives faithfully according to what he's taught, but he also offers forgiveness to his disciples at that Last Supper, in that cup, knowing that they will, in a few moments, deny, betray, and desert him. So Jesus is presented as the Son of God, as God himself in the flesh, come to save his people from their sins. Faith and faithfulness go hand in hand. Faith comes in the most surprising places while the religious and political leaders reject Jesus, and there's this conflict that's the core of the story. And Jesus is the faithful one who would rather die than resort to evil, and he ends up standing in the place of Israel. And it's at this point where we, with great anticipation, wonder, so what's next? I mean, what happens with this story of the Son of God come into the world to bring his self-giving love, to teach these principles of the kingdom of heaven, but instead of being received and welcomed and heaven coming to earth as we would hope and expect and pray for according to the prayer he taught us, instead he's rejected. There's a conflict with the religious leaders, the very people that we would expect to receive this message joyfully, instead turn around and kill him. They condemn him in their courts. They take him to Pilate, who condemns him even though he believes him to be innocent. And Pilate has him flogged and hands him over to be crucified. This is where we are at in the story of Matthew, and we're left wondering. Obviously we think we know the answers. But we're left wondering what comes next. What will happen to this Son of God? We're also left wondering, what does it really mean to follow Jesus? What does it mean for us to be faithful to his call? For us to have faith in who he is, but then also to live faithful lives in the presence of this new community that he's forming and founding through his baptism and through calling his disciples and telling Peter, on this rock I will build my church. What does it mean for us to live faithfully as part of this surprising community? And is our community actually surprising? What does it mean for us to live faithfully? What does it mean for us to live out the good news of this kingdom of heaven in our own lives? And where have we maybe sided with the kingdom of this world? And what does it look like to repent? Turning to Jesus in faith, and then living faithfully in light of the things he teaches. And for the answer to those questions, you're going to have to tune in again next week, and the next week, and the next week. Another couple weeks till we get to the end of the book of Matthew. But what we have consistently seen throughout this series is that the good news of Jesus, according to Matthew, is that God became human, born of the Virgin Mary, in order to save his people from their sins, by ushering in the kingdom of heaven in word and deed. By teaching and living self-sacrificing love, Jesus called others to live faithfully under the reign of God through faith in him. And Jesus challenged all other systems and philosophies that claim to bring salvation. Jesus was faithful to the principles of the kingdom of heaven, even though it cost him his life. May we hear his call and learn to follow in his footsteps as well.